Hello again. I've uploaded a copy of Socrates' Apology, and please read that and watch the video that accompanies it before next week's class. Uh, it's a little bit long. It's longer than most of the assignments I'll give in this class, and it's not necessarily an easy read, but it is Socrates. It is one of the great texts in our culture. Read it with a pencil, slowly. uh, Stop and think about what he's saying quite often. If you just skim it, approximately nothing will come clear. Philosophy texts need to be pondered, but they're worth it. And I'm not going to test you over detailed knowledge of it. I want us to have the text in common so we can use it in the things we're thinking about this quarter. Um, I've been greatly influenced by a lot of philosophers, but when it comes to Socrates, there are two teachers, philosophers in particular, that I think I should mention. Professor Stephen Smith from Yale University and Professor John Kreft from Boston College. If you're familiar with their works, you'll hear echoes of them in what I'm going to say. I recommend both of them to you if you want to know more about this topic. Socrates died in 399 BCE, before Common Era, in Athens. He was condemned to death by a jury of 501 citizens, and his crime was disrespecting the gods of the state. Nearly all philosophy stems from Socrates. Every school of philosophy in the ancient world claimed to be the true descendants of Socrates. Socrates modeled a new way of thinking, a method of intellectual inquiry that could unlock any door. He develops a clear understanding of what a logical argument is. People had always used logic, of course, but Socrates might be the first person to employ logical argument in a systematic way. We still use the phrase the Socratic method to refer to a systematic questioning of ideas, pursuing ever greater clarity, and rejecting anything that couldn't be supported by reasons that you could articulate. His step-by-step method showed that if you accepted a certain premise as true, you necessarily had to accept the conclusions that logically followed it as true too. If all A is B and all B is C, then it absolutely has to be true that all A is C. Socrates didn't invent logic. People had always been logical and had the capacity. The capacity for logic is innate in human beings, but he did awaken others to it and what it meant. Some thinkers have said that the reason science arose in the West and not in any other place was simply because of the influence of Socrates. The idea of step-by-step systematic inquiry into the nature of the situation. The trial of Socrates takes place in the year 399 BC, the same year as his death. He is sentenced to death at the end of that trial. It follows the famous Peloponnesian War, which was between Athens and Sparta, the great powers of the Greek civilization. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens had built the famous Acropolis, the Parthenon. It was a mighty naval power. It was the first substantial democracy in the world. The war had lasted off and on for almost 30 years. Athens was defeated finally in 404 BCE. Keep in mind that 404 BCE is 5 years before 399 BCE. We're on the opposite end of the timeline, which the center of the timeline is at 0, the birth of Christ. At the time Socrates was brought to power, a democratic resistance movement against Sparta had formed, and the leaders of that resistance were the men, including Miletus and Anytus, who brought charges against Socrates. These are men that Socrates refers to in the Apology. The charges against him were corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. So how could the world's most free democracy sentence to death a man for speaking freely about his most important thoughts, and a man who claimed to care for nothing more than virtue and human excellence? For about a year after Sparta defeated Athens, the Spartans set up a government in Athens led by the group that was called the 30 Tyrants. They were hated by most people in Athens. And the democratic resistance had arisen and driven them from power by the time of Socrates' trial. Part of the context of the trial is that friends and students of Socrates had some connection with the 30 Tyrants. So the trial of Socrates takes place in the shadow of a significant military defeat, a strong political resistance, and of conspiracy and betrayal. The political mood in Athens was probably even more volatile than the partisan fighting we see around us today. So people weren't sure which side Socrates was really on. Earlier, a comic poet, Aristophanes, who had fostered a widespread prejudice against Socrates. Socrates' most famous student, Plato, referred to Aristophanes, saying he was part of the old quarrel between poetry and philosophy. Aristophanes was a poet and a playwright. Socrates was a philosopher. That quarrel is a recurring theme in lots of the Socratic dialogues. Socrates comes back to it very often. In the Republic, Socrates argues that it's necessary to censor the poets. If people want to establish and maintain true justice, the poets have got to be controlled. The dispute between poetry, Aristophanes, and philosophy, Socrates, has deep political resonance emerging from the question of who is best to educate the future citizens of Athens. Socrates brings up Aristophanes in his defense. Is it the poets or the philosophers who should shape the vision of mankind? And by poets, keep in mind that very much meant the teachings of Homer and Hesiod. For centuries, the education of Athenians had been dominated by the poetry of such writers as Homer. And that poetry provided models of the heroic life. Hero is a Greek idea. Our whole concept of heroes comes from that ancient Greek poetry like Homer, the heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, those sorts of men. Those models worked in the Greek world, much the way the Bible had worked in Christian Europe, presenting a view of the way the divine wants things to be and clarifying the virtues appropriate to being human. Those poets presumed the virtues of a warrior society, and this literature contributed greatly to Athens' rise as a world power. And to its greatness. And Athens dominated the ancient Mediterranean world at this time. Socrates' teaching is fundamentally different from that of the poets. Homer begins the Iliad by invoking the gods or the goddesses. Sing in me, muse, goddess, the wrath of Achilles. And then he's off talking about that blinding, crippling rage that is motivating Achilles through much of the Iliad. Homer seeks inspiration from the gods and goddesses to tell stories of heroes possessed of superhuman power and passion. But Socrates doesn't do that. He uses conversation, dialogues with the people of Athens focused on reason and persuasion. Socrates doesn't tell stories. He makes arguments, urging people to work with him to discover which arguments best withstand examination by reason. It's asking questions rather than telling stories that is the basis of the Socratic method. Education to Socrates consists of debate, not the recitation of memorized poems. He often turns his method against the teachings of the poets. Aristophanes, the poet, fought back by making Socrates a comic character in his play The Clouds, which show Socrates as a windy fool, talking on and on and on about things above the earth and things under the earth, making the weaker argument appear stronger. Socrates is shown aloft in a balloon to investigate the clouds, and it isn't lost on the audience that Socrates is detached from everything, and he is seldom down to earth. He's accused of supporting incest and dozens of other disgusting things. And because of the popularity of Aristophanes' plays, partly because of them, Socrates has become, by the time of the trial, a contemptible figure for many people, a foolish old man with unsound sentiments. Socrates, meanwhile, is arguing for a new kind of citizen, very different from the Homeric hero who creates a new version of the world. Socrates wants to leave behind Homer's warrior virtues, replacing them with virtues that made people formidable in discussion and argument rather than in war. Socrates wants a world in which it is the best argument rather than the strongest army that wins. And he wants citizens trained in the art of argument. But of course, Socrates' arguments often include stories. He includes a very important story in the Apology, the story of how he came to take on the responsibility of educating the citizens of Athens. The story begins with a friend of his, Chaerephon, who had gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked the gods if there was anyone on earth wiser than Socrates. He was told there was not. By the time of Socrates, many Greeks had become skeptical about the gods, but most still trusted the Delphic oracle because her prophecies seemed always to come true. Socrates acts surprised and full of disbelief at Chaerephon's news. He thought he didn't know much at all. How could he be the wisest man on earth? He set out to understand the oracle statement by engaging in a quest to find someone wiser than himself. So he began a life of questioning poets, statesmen, artists, anyone who had a reputation for being knowledgeable. He asked questions about what it meant to be a good human being. He asked about justice. His focus was on moral and political wisdom. What he learned was that when carefully questioned, the experts couldn't really explain what they thought. They couldn't really answer the questions that followed from their own claims. Their so-called knowledge fell apart when hard questions were asked. This was the beginning of his method, the logical cross-examination of knowledge. What he learned was that the people who thought they were wise turned out not to be wise. After years of questioning people, he concluded that many people who thought that they were wise were really fools, and that he was the wisest man in the world because at least he knew that he did not know. He knew that he was a fool. Knowing that one did not know was wisdom. That was what the oracle meant. He tried to teach this wisdom to others, that they lacked wisdom and therefore they needed to inquire into the truth of things. This response of Socrates, turning toward the education of his fellow man, or at least the interrogation of his fellow Athenians, is often referred to as the Socratic turn. Earlier, Socrates had studied nature, which Greeks were very interested in, but he turned away from that to study the human condition. In many ways, this is the foundational moment in the history of moral philosophy. The charges brought against him are not the same as those brought much earlier by Aristophanes. In Clouds, he was accused of being out of touch with reality and being foolish. But in the court, before the jury, the charges brought against him by Miletus and Anytus are impiety and corruption. A person who honors the gods is pious, so the charge of impiety is that he disrespects the gods. He is blasphemous towards things that society holds sacred, something similar to flag burning that desecrates the ideals of America. Every society is held together by the things that people believe, the shared beliefs or faith that they have in something. In the United States, the nation was held together until recently by the creed articulated in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and with God-given rights. Governments exist to protect their rights, and for the government to be legitimate, it needs to respect the consent of the governed. Socrates agrees that a nation needs to be held together by belief in a set of fundamental principles, and he's concerned with the forces that threaten that kind of belief. One is simple unbelief, founded on disrespect for any authority beyond the self. But the other threat comes from philosophy itself, which is always trying to replace belief with knowledge, to work through ignorance into the greater light of truth. Faith is not enough for the philosopher. One had to give a reasoned account of how things really are. And so it is that philosophy is often at odds with civic faith, with good citizenship, as the general population understands that. Citizens who accept many of society's principles on faith may feel genuinely threatened by the questions asked by the philosopher, who wants to judge those principles by standards that are everywhere and always true, by universal truth. So, was Socrates guilty of impiety? It would appear that he is. He doesn't care about the things that hold the citizens together. He begins his defense by noting that the manner of speech in the court is foreign to him. He says he wants to free people from their worries about their bodies and their money in order that they may contemplate their souls and how to be sure that their souls are in the best possible condition. His concern with matters of the soul have led him into poverty. He doesn't do anything to make money, and away from the politics and the concerns of the day-to-day, to focus entirely on the pursuit of individual virtue, to focus completely on how to be a good person. He wants only to live what he calls the good life, and he wants to persuade others that this is the best use of their own lives. He talks about this in the Apology. This is from section 31D at the bottom of page 14. He makes a direct claim that living a good private life matters much more than being involved in politics. He says, "This is something which began for me in childhood. A sort of voice comes, and whenever it comes, it always turns me away from whatever I am about to do, but never turns me forward. This is what opposes my political activity, and its opposition seems to me altogether noble. For know well, men of Athens, if I had long ago attempted to be politically active, I would long ago have perished, and I would have benefited neither you nor myself. Now do not be vexed with me when I speak the truth, for there is no human being who will preserve his life if he genuinely opposes either you or any other multitude and prevents many unjust and unlawful things from happening in the city. Rather, if someone who really fights for the just is going to preserve himself even for a short time, it is necessary for him to lead a private rather than a public life." So he's not guilty of impiety, at least as he understands the word. Rather, he has come to understand religion and being good differently than most people have. It's a little bit odd because Socrates is one of the most religious men in the history of Athens, and yet he's the only person ever convicted and executed for his religious beliefs. But this leads to Socrates' central insight, which he tries to teach in the Apology. He says to the jury, "If you kill me, you will not harm me, but yourselves. It is impossible that a good man can be harmed by a bad man. Think about that. He's saying that it's not possible for a just man to be harmed by an unjust man. And the reason for this is because the soul is immortal, and only what damages the soul is harmful. And only one's own unjust actions can harm his soul. All bad men can do is harm the body, maybe even killing it, but that isn't something that matters, according to Socrates. He repeats this claim at the end of his speech, his final testimony, at part 41C and D on page 23. You judges should be of good hope toward death, and you should think this one thing to be true, that there is nothing bad for a good man, whether living or dead. It is clear to me that it is now better after all for me to be dead, and to have been released from my troubles. I am not at all angry at those who voted to condemn me, and at my accusers, and yet it was not with this thought in mind that they voted to condemn me and accuse me. Rather, they supposed they would harm me. For this, they are worthy of blame. And then he gives his famous final statement. Now it is time to go away, I to die and you to live. Which of us goes to a better thing is unclear to everyone except to the God. So that's a little bit of an overview of this fascinating work. I've uploaded a PDF copy of it to Schoolology. Try to have it read before next, I guess it would be next Wednesday, and listen to this videotape before then, if you can. Keep in mind, it's not necessary to thoroughly understand everything in the speech. I mean, that's quite a lot, but you should have identified some things that make sense to you, or that you disagree with or agree with. Be thinking about taking a position on something, not on the whole thing necessarily, but on some claim that Socrates makes. I mean, try to come up with a counterclaim that you could make, or something that's kind of maybe not directly agreeing or disagreeing with Socrates, but some idea or thought that he inspires you to have. In other words, you don't need to thoroughly master the entire dialogue, but do use it to have some original thoughts of your own. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.